This is the Grade 10 Performance Learning class reading about the Halifax Explosion off the CanadianEncyclopedia.com. Halifax was devastated on December 6, 1917, when two ships collided in the city's harbor. One of them was a munitions ship, loaded with explosives bound for the battlefields of the First World War. The result was the largest human-made explosion prior to the detonation of the first atomic bombs in 1945. The north end of Halifax was wiped out by the blast and by subsequent tsunami. Nearly 2,000 people died, another 9,000 were maimed or blinded, and more than 25,000 were left without subsequent shelter.
Wartime Harbor. Halifax was busy. Wartime port city in 1917. Its harbor crowded with merchant vessels and warships from Canada and Britain. The city's population of nearly 50,000 was swollen by the constant coming and going of naval officials, sailors, and troops bound for the service in Europe. With one of the finest ice-free harbors in North America, Halifax was an important staging area for transatlantic convoys, which collected in the protected inner expanse of Bedford Basin before ferrying supplies and soldiers to the war effort.
Two of those merchant ships were the Norwegian vessel Emo, en route to New York to pick up relief supplies for the beleaguered population of war-torn Belgium, and the French munition ship Mont Blanc, filled with tons of benzol, picric acid, TNT, and gun cotton, arriving to join a convoy across the Atlantic.
The collision. The IMO was departing the harbor on the morning of December 6, 1917. It was traveling south through the Narrows, the harbor's tightest navigation section, moving faster than it should be and passing to the left port side of oncoming ships, rather than to the right, starboard, which was customary. The Mont Blanc was entering the harbor bound for Bedford Basin when it encountered the IMO in the Narrows sailing toward it. Not only did incoming ships, in this case Mont Blanc, have a right-of-way over outgoing vessels, but the IMO was also sailing too far to the left, in which it should have been Mont Blanc's path.
After a series of whistles and miscommunications between the officers and pilots on the two ships, the IMO struck the starboard bow of the Mont Blanc, generating sparks that ignited benzol stored on Mont Blanc's deck. The burning liquid then seeped into the holds.
For nearly 20 minutes, the Mont Blanc burned, sending a huge plume of black smoke into the sky, attracting the attention of people on shore, including children on their way to school. The spectacle drew many residents to their windows and others towards the ship itself, including teams of firefighters and sailors from other ships wanting to put out the fire on the Mont Blanc.
Few understood the danger except for a handful of harbor and naval officials and the French-speaking crew and the local harbor pilot of the Mont Blanc, who fled the ship after the fire broke out, rowing desperately in lifeboats for the Dartmouth side of the harbor. As they did so, the crippled and burning Mont Blanc drifted towards Pier 6 on the Halifax shore, a busy area containing residential homes, businesses, moored ships, and a large sugar refinery.
The man on shore who did know an explosion was imminent was Vincent Coleman, a railway dispatcher who worked in the nearby rail yards. He was warned by a Navy man during the fire about the Mont Blanc's deadly cargo. Coleman controlled the busy freight and passenger rail traffic coming and going from the Halifax Peninsula. As the Mont Blanc burned and the minutes ticked by, Coleman stayed at his post, tapping out a message on his telegraph key, warning officials at stations up the line to stop any trains, including the 8:55 a.m. train from St. John, New Brunswick, with hundreds of passengers on board, from entering Halifax. It's not clear whether Coleman was actually responsible for holding up the St. John train, but his message in the final minutes of his life was clear. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys.
The Mont Blanc exploded just before 9:05 a.m., more than 2.5 kilometers square of the north end of Halifax, then known as Richmond, was totally leveled, either by the blast, the subsequent tsunami that washed over the neighborhood, or the raging fire caused when structures collapsed inwards on lanterns, stoves, and furnaces. Homes, offices, churches, factories, vessels, the railway station and the freight yards, and people in the immediate area were obliterated. Farther from the epicenter, Siddle Hill deflected shockwaves from south and west Halifax, where shattered windows and doors were prominent damage. Across the harbor, Dartmouth suffered devastation to the lesser degree, since the north section was sparsely developed. However, the Mackay settlement and the Tufts Cove was completely destroyed.
The blast shattered windows in Truro, 100 kilometers away, and was heard in Prince Edward Island. The crew of the fishing boat Wave, working off the coast of Massachusetts, even claimed to have heard the boom rumbling across the ocean. Author Laura MacDonald describes the ferocity of the explosion in her book, Curse of the Narrows.
The air blast blew through the narrow streets, toppling buildings and crashing through windows, doors, walls, and chimneys until it slowed to 756 miles an hour, 5 miles below the speed of sound. The blast crushed internal organs, exploding lungs and eardrums of those standing closest to the ship, most of whom died instantly. It picked up others, only to trash them against trees, walls, and lampposts, with enough force to kill them. Roofs and ceilings collapsed on top of their owners. Floors dropped into the basement and trapped families under timber, beams, and furniture. This was particularly dangerous for those closest to the harbor because a fireball, which was invisible in the daylight, shot out over a 1 to 4 mile area surrounding the Mont Blanc. Richmond houses caught fire like so much kindling. In houses able to withstand the blast, windows stretched inward until the glass shattered around its weakest point, sending out a shower of arrow-shaped silvers that cut their way through curtains, wallpaper, and walls. The glass spared no one. Some people were beheaded where they stood. Others were saved by a falling bed or bookshelf. Many others, who had watched the fire seconds before, awoke to find themselves unable to see.
The blast shot vaporized sections of the ship and cargo upwards in a great fireball. The ship's anchor was sent flying across the city and over the northwest arm, nearly 4 kilometers away, where it remains to this day. Meanwhile, burning metal fragments of the ship showered down on Halifax, along with black rain of carbon particles. People were also blown through the sky. Charles Mayers, the third officer of the vessel Middleham Castle, was picked up and dropped nearly 1 kilometer from his ship, landing atop Fort Needleham Hill. "I was wet when I came down," Mayer said. "I had no clothes on when I came to, except my boots. There was a little girl near me, and I asked where we were. She was crying and said she did not know where we were. Some men gave me a pair of trousers and a rubber coat."
Death and destruction. Across Halifax, there were miraculous stories of survival, and equally stories of tragedy. Many children were killed on their walk to school that morning, or blinded by flying glass. Those that survived the blast stumbled home, only to find their houses shattered, or their parents dead or wounded among the wreckage.
Nearly 2,000 people either died instantly or succumbed to their injuries in the days that followed. Morgue records from 1918 show 1,611 known dead or missing. About a third of them are under the age of 15. By 2004, the number of dead had been revised to 1,952. 9,000 more were wounded, including 300 blinded or partially blinded by flying glass.
More than 1,500 buildings were destroyed and 12,000 damaged. 6,000 people were made homeless, among the 25,000 overall that lacked proper shelter after the explosion, a problem made worse by the winter blizzard that struck Halifax the next day. Total property damage amounted to an estimated $35 million.
Relief assistance was immediate and extensive. Halifax was well served by the legions of well-disciplined naval and army personnel who happened to be in the city at the time of the disaster, providing aid and semblance of order. The explosion made headlines around the world. Trains from throughout the Maritimes and from central Canada and New England soon brought medical aid, doctors, food, clothing, building materials, and skilled laborers. The continuing assistance organized in nearby Boston and provided by the Massachusetts Halifax Relief Committee was particularly noteworthy.
Money donated by the government, industry, and individuals worldwide eventually totaled to some $30 million and was administered from 1918 to 1976 by the Halifax Relief Commission, created by the federal government to oversee claims for loss and damage, rehousing, and the rehabilitation of explosion victims.
Halifax's angry survivors demanded answers and scapegoats in the wake of the tragedy. At first, there were rumors that German saboteurs were behind the explosion. However, a judicial inquiry, heavily influenced by the aggressive tactics of the lawyer hired to represent the owners of the IMO, quickly focused blame on 3 men: Emile Lemedic, the Mont Blanc's captain, Francis Mackey, the harbor pilot on board, and Frederick Wyatt, the naval officer in command of the harbor. On the 4th of February 1918, the inquiry found Mont Blanc solely at fault for the disaster.
Lemedic, Mackey, and Wyatt were arrested and charged with manslaughter, although the charges were later dropped for lack of evidence. In 1919, the inquiry's conclusions were appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, which declared that both Mont Blanc and IMO were equally at fault. A verdict upheld with the Privy Council in London. At that time, Canada's highest judicial authority. Ultimately, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for failures leading to the explosion.
In 1958, harbor pilot Francis Mackey told CBC Radio, IMO, "Come out on his wrong side, broke the rules, come out on the wrong side of a streamer on the wrong side up above the Narrows, and then come down the wrong side again and struck me. There were no ships allowed to come out when a ship is coming in was bound in. Had the right of way myself, but she came out."
There are numerous plaques, markers, pieces of embedded explosion wreckage, and gravestones scattered throughout Halifax that commemorate the disaster. One of the most obvious reminders is the city's famous Hydrostone neighborhood, a series of housing blocks built in the once devastated North End. Using Hydrostone bricks to provide shelter for homeless victims, the neighborhood's former name, Richmond, is nowhere to be found.
Next door to Hydrostone in Fort Needham Park, a grassy hill topped with concrete memorials where every December people gather above the Narrows to hear the ringing of the memorial Coriolanus bells and to remember the victims of the disaster.
Perhaps the most potent reminder of the tragedy and the response to it is the large Christmas tree cut every year from the Nova Scotian woods and erected in central Boston, a gift of thanks from the people of Halifax to the city that provided essential relief and support in the wake of the explosion.